Hi everyone, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi everyone. First I will introduce myself. My name is Mahdi Anani. I'm the president and co-founder of the Classical Music Club. So probably many of you know that we've been talking about organizing those talks for quite a while now. And we are very happy to finally launch our new project, which we called Music Talks. Now, Music Talks, as you might guess, is kind of a play on words, because obviously we are holding talks on music. And because the music does talk, it conveys messages, and we should listen to those messages, and we should listen very carefully. So it's a project for musicians and non-musicians. As you may know, we did mention in the invitations that no prior musical proficiency is required. And its objective is to cultivate a culture of listening to music and appreciating music as an art form. Okay? The art of listening is one pillar of this project. It will comprise sessions that will discuss certain topics, concepts about listening to music, such as musical form, musical syntax, and those are concepts that are largely alien to people who listen to music nowadays, unless someone is involved in the study of music. Okay. Now, it is not really necessary for someone to be familiar with those concepts to enjoy music, but it certainly goes a long way to be able to better understand and appreciate the works of geniuses such as Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, etc., and is guaranteed to elevate your listening experience. Okay. So our talk today will be led by my friend Wiaam Haddad, as you may know. Wiaam is the co-founder of the club. He is currently the musical director. Wiaam is an architect. He graduated from AUB with a BA in architecture. Last year, a Bachelor of Architecture last year. Wiaam is a pianist, he's a composer, and actually many of his compositions have frequently featured in our concerts here in Assembly Hall. And one of his compositions featured in the music festival of the Untitled Chapter last November as well. I could think of no one who is more fit to give such talks than Wiaam. He is all in all a well-rounded musician. So we hope you enjoy the talk. Listen and listen carefully, as we always like to tell you. And we look forward to hear your feedback after the talk. All right? Thank you, and enjoy.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this talk, which is the first, we hope, many talks to come. So the material that I will present will serve as a foundation which we will build on later talks. So it is a foundational talk, I would say. I'm sure we are all enthusiastic about music, but not all of us are familiar with the jargon. I would say that's why I tried to choose terms which are accessible, maybe to all of us. But please do feel free to interject when you feel that something isn't clear. I'll be happy to elaborate. So I'll start with the general framing of the talk, then go into illustrations of what I've presented, the point I'm making also, with listening examples that we'll go through and which I will do frequent trips to the board to illustrate. And then we'll open up for discussion and for questions if you feel like something is necessary to elaborate on some topics. So framework and pieces. So we're going to talk about understanding music and how to listen and why this technique of listening is important, especially when we're talking about classical music, and I'll define what I mean. So that's why the talk is called The Art of Listening as a whole. Of course, we are approaching music as an art form, and we are considering music that does not belong in the background. Music that is music that was written with an intent for people to listen and to consider and to contemplate. We are talking about music that belongs to the fine arts, fine music, or classical music, as we can say, or however inaccurate the term might be. I would not prefer the French term musique savante, which is more indicative of what we're talking about. Obviously, this is not the only type of music that exists. You can hear a tune in the elevator, you can hear a jingle on the radio, you can hear it in commercials and so on. But you can apply this technique of listening to all types of music, which we will call active listening. But of course, what I argue is that classical music, in classical music, you have no other option. This is the only and the better technique to understand this music. You have to be an active listener. And you will not get it if you don't. It is not the way you hear, it is not the same way that you hear the beat in the gym or other forms of music. You can apply the same techniques, but of course, for classical music, this is the prime way to do it. So what we will discuss is why is this the case? Why active listening is the only way to enjoy music as an art? And what is active listening anyway? So active listening, why and what? I start with talking about perception in the arts in general, just to make comparisons. So let's start by approaching the subject from a different angle, for a better perspective. And I'll start by trying to detach myself from the music and its specificities, let's say. So let's look at other arts. I look at sculpture and then I look at painting. So the arts are not perceived in the same way. For example, if you take a painting lives in the world of two spatial dimensions. That is, whatever is painted on the canvas, you can take your time in gazing and looking at it in detail and as a whole. So time in this case is not a parameter which contains what the beholder can perceive. So the listener in music has, the beholder in these arts has temporal agency. I can take time and I write it down. So this is in other arts, specifically in visual arts. The beholder has temporal agency. That means they can take their time, they can go about, look at it in detail, look at it in a whole, gaze on it. In sculpture, this is the same. We live in a three-spatial dimension. You can take your time looking around, move about the subject, different angles, and of course the sculptors themselves, they can pay attention to these sequences of views that are found there. So in sculpture and painting, we can focus in detail and on the object as a whole. Music is an art, which is different. It lives in one world, the world of a single dimension, the dimension of time. And immediately you can see the limitations at hand. That is that time moves independently. So the listener in music has you as a listener of music have no power over its flow. At no point can you stop, go back, seek forward. Because of its continuous nature, the listener can never, at one specific point, see the whole. They are always bound to a moment of a continuous flow of what is and what will be. This, of course, is the subject of memory, and half of my talk will focus on this aspect of perception, specifically on short-term memory and on long-term memory. What I'm interested in, at the beginning at least, is this cognitive process that allows us to make sense of what we hear, not an exposition and a catalogue of musical forms, which will be the subject of later. We will see what musical form here is in some examples, but this is not the subject of this talk. So what I'm interested in is the cognitive process itself. On a cognitive level, when you hear music, a multitude of data is bombarded in your way. Pitch, rhythm, melody, tune, and so on, articulation, instrumentation. So the brain has to make sense and coherence to all that is given, which makes music intelligible rather than a series of arbitrary set of sounds, or what we call noise, informal. And what we will see is that it is musical form and syntax that can make intelligibility out of the material, of the music material. So musical form and thus it is actually the role of the listener to place. So it is easy to see why the process of listening can't be but an active one and a conscious one. It requires an effort from the listener because to perceive these patterns, our memory should be alert. We have to differentiate two types of memories, as I said: the short-term memory, which the job of the short-term memory is to recognize these instances, and long-term memory, which puts them all together. So we have to differentiate between the short-term memory and the long-term. It is the role of the listener, to place recognizable objects on this unidimensional temporal horizon. So as time flows, you have this horizon, and we as listeners perceive instances that come as we go along. And what we have is what we perceive is that we put by the short-term memory, we recognize a chronological address on this temporal horizon. And as time unfolds, these will be placed. I'll do an analogy that will illustrate this. So to illustrate this process, let's consider the image of someone in a taxi, looking outside the window as the landscape outside unfolds. In this case, the passenger is the listener. So I'm drawing parallelisms between the passenger and a taxi, the landscape outside, the window, and musical listener. So the taxi driver is the interpreter, let's say, the musician. He drives us. The window is the short-term memory, which is around 8 to 16 seconds. And through this window of short-term memory, which is the window of the taxi itself, we consolidate the view of the landscape as it unfolds outside. So this is the taxi. The window from which we can perceive, a small window, which we perceive short-term instances. And as it moves along, the landscape unfolds. So what happens is that through this window, one creates mental images which will be consolidated at the end of the journey, after the journey has finished, by the long-term memory, and thus you can perceive the whole. Let's take an example. You know Bliss Street. Of course, as you go through, imagine yourself in a taxi which is driving you along this. And what you see is instances. You see at the beginning, Zafar and Zaid. You go through, you see 1866, the hotel, Grab and Go, Bliss House, Monk Met, Onsi Concierge, Breakaway, McDonald's, and you end with the sun. Those instances are the short-term memory which consolidate mental images of chronological addresses, and at the end, long-term memory will consolidate everything. So what we have, the analogy is the passenger, is the listener, the landscape or the streetscape is the piece as a whole in position. The taxi driver is the musician who drives us, and the window is the short-term memory from which we perceive this state scale. Of course, there are interesting landscapes, as there are interesting music pieces. The taxi driver, the musician, can go too fast or too slow, can take sudden turns, and so on. And the passenger himself or herself can fall asleep, thus missing essential parts of the journey, and thus they can consolidate an entire whole view of the state scale. It is also important to point out that music is not the music score, the music sheets, the music notes, which is an allegory to the roadmap that the taxi driver will use. So it is useful to make a trip, but you can use the score to retro-engineer the composition, but it is not something that's comparable to painting on the wall. So it's not the music itself. The music itself is perceived through hearing, not through scoring. So active listening, which is consolidated by short-term memory that serves as recognition, and long-term memory, which serves to consolidate form. So we will start with an example from the vocal tradition. That is music with a text, usually which is written on poems. And in most cases, the music has to adapt to the form imposed by the text. In traditional poems, of course, stanzas are the most. And stanzas here, we have 6 stanzas differentiated by gaps. So stanzas are a group of lines within this poem, usually set from others by blank line, indentation, and so on. So stanzas usually have regular rhythm and the same metrical scheme, sequence of stressed and unstressed syllables. We'll take an example, which is the rendition of a poem by Goethe, and there are many renditions of this poem. We will start by the rendition made by Carl Friedrich Zelter, and try to, of course, in all the examples that I will give, try to be attentive, because this is the point, and try to see the patterns that the composer uses while trying to render this poem into music. This is how we render it. And this is called Strophic form. And so what happens cognitively is that we identify A using our short-term memory. And when it recurs every time, we know already what happens, and the long-term memory would consolidate a repetition that happens in each instance. I'll continue for one stanza, if it isn't clear. Most of the cases will take simple form. The second example is on the same poem, but it's rendered by different composer, this time by Franz Schubert.
Es war ein Königtum, vertreu wie Sab das Grab, den Sternen seine einen goldenen Becher gab. Es ging ihm nichts darüber, lehrt ihn jeden Spaß. Die Augen gingen ihm über, so oft der Trank daraus. Und als kam zu sterben, zählt seine Städte im Reich, gönnt alles seinen Erben, den Becher nicht zugleich. Saß ein Königsmahl, die Ritter um ihn her, auf hohen Vätersaale, dort auf dem Schloss am Meer.
Okay, I'll stop here. So, what Schubert did is that he used two stanzas for one melodic line that is recurring. So let's call it X. X. 3 times. Okay. It's still in strophic form, but how he dealt with the same material was different. So those are two examples on the same topic.
I'm a bit confused. Is the A a note like every?
No, A is a letter.
Okay, what does it correspond to?
It corresponds to the melody line. So everything, so let's take the first stanza for example. And first example.
The stanza is the line, right?
No, the stanza is the paragraph.
Okay.
So it's 4 lines in this case. So what happens in Zelter's elaboration, or how he set music to this poem, is that he had one melodic line, which recurs at each stanza, in each instance. The same melody, the same tune is recurring in each stanza. Okay? Same line, from the beginning of the stanza to the end. The whole melodic line, melodic phrase.
And is the stanza the window, or is the line the window?
The window is the cognitive process, if we're doing the parallelism, is the cognitive process by which you perceive and you identify this chronological address. I heard this tune. When you get to the second stanza, I'm hearing the second tune. So you identify in your short-term memory that I heard A. I'm calling it A, you can call it, but it represents this melodic line that was used in this stanza. In the case of Schubert, what he did, they're both in strophic form, which is a recurring, the same melody recurring every time, is that he chose 2 stanzas for one melodic line. So you have 6 stanzas, you have the melodic line recurring 3 times.
Why didn't you call the second one A, B, A, B, A, B?
You can do this. So what we're trying to do is, this is what we call segmentation analysis. And you can segment each. Even in Zelter's case, the stanza can be divided into 2. But what we're trying to see here is that what is the largest unit that is being repeated.
we were rehearsing a couple days ago and I asked him the same question.
So you can divide it even into smaller pieces, of course. But the unit that's being replicated is this stanza. Okay. So of course you can see the patterns that we've identified. So those examples are of how composers dealt with stanzas and made use of memory, of course, through recurrence, anticipation, and form. It is a simple repetition, so there's nothing new of what we call strophic form, and also what we call the AAAA, or the repeating form. So this poem was also rendered by Liszt, Schumann, von Bülow, Massenet-Gounod, so it's very famous, and you can compare how they dealt with the same text. So this is strophic form. So when you reach the second strophe, you get the recurring unit, and your long-term memory, there is a chronological address. I heard the same melody twice, thrice, 4 times, etc. And our short memory has the job of identifying what we will sing. So it registered that we heard in the first strophe, melody A, the second strophe, melody A, etc. So we can see the different ways which the composer approached the stanzas, for example, Schubert and Zelter, but they follow the same principle, that is the strophic form. And this is simple form, which is also viable for instrumentation, for instrument music, without singing, without text. With an obvious difference is that the composer is not bound by the text. So functionally, there is always the idea of recognition by association, associating with what I already had perceived. If you look through the window, so back to the analogy, everything is different if everything is different. So you cannot create chronological addresses because there is a cacophony of everything coming all around. So there's nothing to compare to. There's no reference. We always need what I call a perception of redundance. There is some element that should recur at each instance to make so that I can compare whatever comes later with it. So this repetition serves a function. It's not redundant, and we'll see how. But there is also this element. The text here animates the music. Okay, but when you get to instrumental music, it's a bit more difficult. So, and I'll take an example by the Ottoman composer, Romanian prince. Let's get off Western classical music, but from the 18th century. And here it's instrumental, but it's also instrumental. You should have noticed that in instrumental music, that where the text doesn't animate in the music, or the music doesn't animate the text, the other cases. So this configuration of strophic form quickly becomes too redundant. So here comes the composer's use of differentiation. Even in the last example, although there is a simple repetition of the melody, there is a slight change from one strophe to the next in instrumentation. So this is the choice of instruments. He was adding instruments. This is the basic idea of what we call variation, or the form of variation. So we talked about strophic form. And what happens is that you have a melody, or what we call a theme, which is varied in some sense at each repetition. So instrumentation may be changed, the subject may be modified, the harmony may be changed, some sort of rhythmic alteration may take place. So, and this form is represented, we represent it as A prime, A double prime. We're using A always because there is some sort of resemblance to the initial theme, but also there is some variation. So here you can see increasingly, as the form becomes more complex, the importance of attention and active listening. So we are still in the realm of simple forms, but the whole intention behind the composition fails if the listener does not perceive the changes and the similarities of changes and similarities compared with the initial theme and between also the variations themselves. So let's take an example from Mozart. Simple tune, very known melody. Rhythmically, harmonically, texture, and it's also transformed maybe in tonality, and character, and so on. So Mozart effectively took a known theme, which he didn't invent. This is a song. and effectively transformed it into different permutations that resemble the theme in some ways, but differ in others. And this is the point. You have to perceive the similarities and the differences. Let's take another example by Brahms. I'll skip an example. Another solution to the problem of redundance, as I said, which has its roots also in poetry, is what we call rondo form. So in poetry, we have a form that has a recurring stanza, a refrain. So poetry starts, you start with a stanza, and you go to another, and then you go back to the initial stanza. You go to another, a third. So it's represented in. We start with A, for example. We go to B. The next iteration will be A again. We go to C. The next iteration will be A. So there is a recurring familiar theme that was introduced in the beginning. So it shares the trick or the technique of variation form by having a repeated musical material, but also introducing new material. So this is done by restating the original theme, as we call it the refrain. Between each iteration, between each instance of this theme, main theme or refrain, we have interjections, and these interjections we call them episodes or couplet. They are presented, of course. The form is A, B, A, C, A, B, A, etc. Where A is the original theme. And so we can clearly have identified the recurring material, and the musical form arises from mentally organizing the unfolding material. So Clearly, alertness and memory are involved in this process, as we've explained, but also anticipation, because you also always anticipate something new, but also you anticipate the recurring material that will come at some point. So let's listen. Famous example from Rameau. I'll play it on the screen. Don't neglect the theatrical aspect, because it's part of the show. So, and you will notice that there is an introduction. I'll talk about the introduction to the music, which is a music introduction also, but it doesn't belong to the form itself. Okay, you'll have to listen. So you will notice in a lot of examples that there are introductions or a prelude or something that precedes the core body of the musical form, which we can study independently. We call it affixing, so adding the suffixes and prefixes, which is a separate study in itself. In both cases, the prefix structure, the prelude, the toccata, introduce some aspect of the main corpus, the main body. In the cases, it could be as long or even longer than the main section. So the same goes for suffixes, as in the European tradition and other tradition, it is more common in the European tradition than other traditions that I know of, at least. So we usually call this suffix the coda, or which means the day in Italian. In Arabic we call it تغيير الليل. So, and it's usually a highly declarative form of the initial main material that was presented at the beginning. We'll take another example on rondo, and then we'll end with a short talk on motifs. So the rondo is the third movement from Mozart's flute concerto. So here you can see it at a bigger scale, of course. The example with Rameau was smaller, shorter segments. Here it's more elaborate, but it follows the same formal organization. So I'll end with motifs, and I'll shift gears completely because we were talking about music before, and motifs lives in a much smaller scale and has another different functions and syntax and so on. But I use it to illustrate how the cognitive process works. So the cognitive process through examples, we will talk about motifs, which will serve as an introduction also to the second talk, which will talk about musical syntax, because the motif itself is the basic building block of course, music. And syntax in general, in a general sense, which we borrowed from linguistics, syntax, is a general, deals with the regularities and structures. That is how smaller parts, building blocks, meaningfully fit together to create larger structures. And for example, in linguistics, this is how words are organized to make sentences. Of course, we try to draw parallels with the field of linguistics, but this doesn't mean that there is a total equivalence between the two. Okay. So we will deal with the smallest building block, which is the motif. And the motif itself is a short, inconclusive, recurring unit of music. So its recurrence is almost never the same, which is part of the technique of variation. It is transposed, altered, rhythmically altered, melodically altered, etc. So it undergoes many permutations as it lives through musical composition. So you will find short, inconclusive segments of music all around the literature, but that doesn't mean that they're motifs. The recurrence of a motif is an essential part of its definition. So we will start with an infamous example from Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and then we'll take an example from Bach, and we will end on this. So Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, we'll listen to the exposition from the first movement, first movement is built on the famous motif, which we'll hear in the first two bars. This instance is a recurrence of the motif itself. So thus, and the composer, of course, uses this as a building block in his composition. The second example is a fugue by Johann Sebastian Bach from the second book of the Untitled Chapter. The subject is divided into two motifs, which are recurring. I'll just play them just to make sure they are differentiated properly. So the subject of the fugue is something like that. It's divided into two motifs, which will recur independently and are being permutated throughout the fugue. So the first motif very attentive, this is one of the very dense views because the motif is repeated many times and there are little gaps between one repetition and the other, and sometimes, of course, they collapse, they come together, what we call strepted. Densely compacted and recurring motifs there are in NQ. So to conclude, as we can see, because of the limitations of the cognitive process, that is memory, and the limitations of the form, the art form, that exists in one temporal dimension, music as an art form is appreciated only through active listening. We looked at how this plays in examples musical form, in rondo, in strophic form, and theme and variation, and on a smaller scale, that is in motifs. And I'll conclude with a quote from Sir Roger Scruton which illustrates, which concludes everything and well says everything that we're talking about. That there is no doubt that music is something that we can understand or fail to understand. The purpose of the listener is to follow the musical journey as rhythm, melody, harmony unfolds according to their own inner logic, as to make audible patterns linking part to part. So thank you for attending, and if you have questions and so on, we can take them.
So you said that to detect variation, you need to concentrate, and then at the end you focus that the appreciation has to involve active listening. Is there a dimension of listening that we may be losing on in case we just try to listen by just without concentrating? We go with the flow and we feel it. Is this a dimension that's too primitive, too ignorant, or it has its merits?
Okay. I mean, you can do everything, anything you want. So it doesn't matter. But if you want to appreciate it truly, because the composer has an intent, and to perceive this intent, you have to follow. I'm not sure what you mean by appreciating as in following the flow, as in loving the music. Maybe you're perceiving it at the subconscious level. This might be the case, and it is the case in many people that we've contacted which do not have any formal training but are good listeners. So good listening doesn't mean that you should know these formally, but an attention to this form is very well commended, and it will help a lot for people that are not familiar with the form itself, not familiar with this type of music.
I also have something to add. I think I do understand what you're trying to say as well. I think we can appreciate music on different levels. Sometimes some sort of music, I don't think this is the kind of music, but some other types of music, they can serve their purpose by just the listener listening to them maybe passively. Sometimes if someone is feeling mad, maybe you put some calm, soothing music, which doesn't have really much going on, except that it makes you feel more at ease. Maybe it's one example. But for music that adds dance when it comes to themes, harmony, rhythm, of course you can listen to it passively. You might also enjoy it. You might maybe catch on some nice melody here and there, but to truly know everything that is going on, you will have to concentrate.
The point is that you will be missing out on a lot if you don't.
It's like if you have a painting, if you have a very sophisticated painting and you are looking maybe beside it. You know?
Yeah, but the question, are we missing a lot on the other level or dimension or way of listening, where you don't want to think, you want to feel the music, and then he takes you on a journey, the composer, by this repetition, by making you oh my God, memorize or know the theme which is being repeated.
I think
you don't need to concentrate to know the theme.
I'm not calling for ultimate concentration. Maybe if you hear some piece of music multiple times, I think what you're talking about is the subconscious, the same cognitive process, but happening on a subconscious level. I think that is the case. And this is the case mostly for people who aren't trained in music. This is how I used to listen before I was trained in music at a young age. But when you get these, you can talk about them, you can categorize them, you can communicate them. This is the difference. I think the same cognitive process is happening, of course, but knowing it maybe is a good thing to have.
Yeah, I don't think you're advocating that every time you listen to music you have to think about it consciously, about what's happening, but you have to pay attention to it. In other words, you don't put it in the background and do something else and talk to others. Music is meant to be listened to actively, but this doesn't mean analyzing every single phrase.
Yeah, exactly. So I made the point that having the score, for example, is not particularly important for listening. You can retro-engineer, you can analyze as much as you want, similar to what we were doing now. But what I was trying to prove or advocate, or my position is that for the cognitive process to take place, to understand the music, to listen as it was intended by the composer, there should be some sort of active process involved on the part of the listener. This doesn't mean that every time you have to listen it in this way. This doesn't mean that any type of music would fit this rubric even. But this this type of listening is how you should, and is the better way to appreciate music as an art.
It's a sort of better awareness
Yeah, exactly.
It's better awareness about how you can appreciate the music, and you can listen, you can the basic, the unconscious way, and this is it's an elevation in the process, which is something that I mean, of course, I learned about it. So yeah, essentially you have two types, strophic, and the last one was the
Rondo.
no, I think the
motifs.
The
Motifs.
motif.
Yeah.
Motif. So these are, I think, the two types that you stressed on.
Yeah, they were examples to illustrate the process itself. So there are a lot of forms that maybe need more attention.
But this has nothing to do with the composition.
It could.
It could.
A well-versed composer knows these, and it makes their life easier. Okay.
So just to add also to what you were saying, when you become aware of this, and when you listen to enough pieces of music, while keeping this in mind, it becomes second nature. You know, it becomes actually an important point to make is that back at the time of composers such as Bach and Beethoven, I don't think they used to categorize it in this way.
No.
This is analytic analysis. But it was commonly known that when they used to write a piece of music, it was common practice to write a music in such a structure. So the structure exists, but it wasn't really analyzed. But we are analyzing it to be able to properly understand it.
Yeah, to properly understand it, but especially in this case, to make a point which is different than the structure itself. I'm not trying to teach the structures, the form. And usually, it's not necessary to know the forms, even, I would argue. But at an unconscious level, even, this process takes place, even when we don't know.
Is it sort of a bit like a chicken and egg scenario?
Yeah.
Where the forms developed, then we understood them, but at the same time we sort of had to understand them to develop.
Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't formalized. What Nahi was talking about is that theoretical understanding of forms was not in the educational curricula at the time. And so this is 19th century conservative is trying to make sense of what's. Okay.
Thank you.
Do you have any more questions? Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning, we will be having more talks. We will dive deep into more specific topics. So Wiaam mentioned a few forms such as variations, rondo, and Strophic. I think we will also at some point we will have a lecture on what we think is the most important form of all, the sonata form. And the most important is a subjective term, but the sonata form. But before, maybe I think the next talk will be on musical syntax. We gave you a small taste by elaborating on the motifs. And thank you for listening. And we'd like to have your feedback, honest feedback. This was our first talk. It was kind of an experiment, which we intend to carry on with. But we'd like to have any kind of feedback, whether positive, negative. There's no negative feedback. It's always constructive feedback. So
You want one feedback now?
yes.
I wish it's longer because sometimes it's being used to listen. So
Yes.
to enjoy listening and have enough time, this will help the lecturer say what he wants to say, and we have more time to
You
enjoy.
have a point.
Especially that you spend a lot of time to come here. Some people pay a lot for petrol.
Yeah, I understand.
So
The issue is that we have to accommodate because some people have limited times. But I think you make it. If we have the chance to listen more,
Like,
maybe for the next time, we'll keep that in mind. Yes.
Maybe you can post the links to the listening samples.
Yeah.
Yes. If you want, we can post them on our Instagram page.
But also, those of you who are interested in following up with the clubs, we have a WhatsApp group, and we will post recommended listening on these.
We have a WhatsApp group. We have an Instagram page. You can follow us on the Instagram page. And if you have, by the way, any questions, you can contact us. And if you're around the UV, we can always arrange for informal sessions where we can discuss. It's always an idea.
So I was actually going to add on to that. Say, if you recommend resources to read.
Yeah. We will. I'll prepare that and we'll share
Take
it.
a contact and
Yeah.
we'll send you.
What you send out emails as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll take your email
Alright.
and we'll add you to the mailing list. Any feedback that appreciated?
Thank you.
How did you find it accessible? Was it too specific? Was it too general? Was it too general? وقف.
كيف؟
So was it? Do you want to listen for the